Today is shaping up to be very interesting. The first witness was a neighbor from the Deercliff Road area. He owned a garage which had surveillance, and that testimony was a few minutes. The defense had no questions. And the next witness is a very nervous Pawel. They got some background information on him. He'd come from Poland in about the year 2000. He has a wife and kids. The kids were born in America. He's a carpenter, a trade that he learned once coming to America. He met Fotis in approximately 2004. He started working for Fotis in 2016. And he started working with Fotis when he got his green card. Pawel met Jennifer, met the kids, met the nanny. He characterizes Jennifer as a nice person. He helped her to move some things out of the house. And at one point, he ended up saying to her, look, I'm not really comfortable with this because if Fotis finds out, I'm going to lose my job. Pawel met Michelle after Jennifer and Fotis split. And there was an interaction that occurred between Fotis, Pawel, and another guy in the office that I think is significant, but the jury didn't hear it all in detail. There was quite the argument between the lawyers as to whether or not this information should be admissible, how much, and all of that. So I'm just going to tell you what the witness said. Fotis comes into the office one day and he's talking to the audio video contractor guy at 4 Group. And he's showing the guy photos he has on his phone. And he's asking the guy, is this a camera? Is that a camera? And they were photos of around Jennifer's house. So he was trying to figure out where all the cameras were around her house. Now, you tell me that's not premeditation. This was about a month before the crime. The defense argued that this conversation that Michelle had nothing to do with, and what was in Fotis's mind is not relevant because this is Michelle's trial, not Fotis's trial. So what he's doing and what's going on in his head outside of Michelle shouldn't be used against Michelle. So there was this big argument about it. There were indications that the judge was treating it as a statement of a co-conspirator. Well, the defense got upset, and I see where they are on this, and said, look, you can't treat this as a co-conspirator because that hasn't been proven. First, there has to be proof that they are co-conspirators, and none of that's been proven. And the defense can't exactly cross-examine Fotis. They argue back and forth, and the judge pretty much let it be allowed in. But then when the jury came back and the prosecution asked the question, the issue of the photos on the phone didn't really come out. Fotis had 2 dogs, a lab, and Jennifer had a small dog. The lab ended up getting sick, and Pawel took the lab to the vet. And a couple of days later, Pawel was asking Fotis in front of Michelle, so how's the dog? And Fotis was unhappy and saying Jennifer won't allow the kids to come and say goodbye. The dog has to be put down. So he's very, very unhappy about her not allowing the kids to come. And Michelle said, and this is a quote from the witness, that bee should be buried next to the dog. How many people say stuff like that in the YouTube comments on my own channel? And I see things like, oh, that person should, and then horrible things. People wish horrible things on people, including unaliving. And for sure, there's not going to be warm, fuzzy feelings between Michelle and Jennifer. Michelle's only hearing what Fotis is telling her. And now he's upset because his dog is going to die and Jennifer won't allow the kids to come. The problem with these statements is if something does happen, you've made a statement like that. And don't think that no one is going to hold this against her. Let's get to the Tacoma, because I'm still having issues with this. I think there are things that Michelle didn't say. So, Pawel has owned the Tacoma since 2012. It's a 2001 vehicle, and it was registered in his wife's name. He described a snowplow on the front of the Tacoma. I think the reason that it was important for the prosecution to bring this out is that it further reinforces the identification that the police made when looking at surveillance videos. Not every red Tacoma is going to have this unique feature. In 2016, Pawel was made a project manager, and between 2016 and 2019, the prosecution asked who else had been project managers for Group. Pawel said that between 2016 and 2019, he was the only one. The prosecution's asking, well, okay, who else has been there before? So Pawel rattled off some names, and one of the names that he said was Andy Loomis. In Michelle's second interview, the name of Andy Loomis had been brought up. At the time, when I'm listening to this interview, I'm thinking, this is really interesting because Andy disappears. He's no longer project manager, so he's gone from Group. And not long before Jennifer disappeared, Andy reappeared. And the explanation that Fotis gave to Michelle was, oh yeah, I'm hiring him as a project manager, not full time. And even as Michelle was describing this in the interview, and maybe it's because I'm always suspicious, in my head I'm thinking, Fotis felt some need to explain to Michelle why Andy has reappeared. Now, why is that? On the stand, when the prosecution's questioning Pawel, he asked all these other project managers, Andy included, do they sometimes come back and do smaller jobs, or do they come back and then leave again? And Pawel said no. Once they're gone, they're gone. So this thing about Andy coming back is an anomaly. It came out that Fotis didn't like people saying no to him. No surprise, considering what we've learned about him already, and this further reinforces that. Pawel wanted to renovate his own home, and Fotis offered the services or the assistance of Group. And most people would take an offer like that, but Pawel refused. And when he was asked, why did you refuse? He said, well, because I didn't want Fotis taking over. I wanted to make my house the way I wanted, and Fotis would come in and have it done the way he wanted. They brought up the issue of Greek Easter. So a few times, Pawel went and had Greek Easter at Fotis's house. And when he was asked why, he said, well, Fotis was inviting everybody. And then the prosecution was trying to get out that Fotis's family wasn't around him. They didn't come to this. It came out that in 2019, the children were not present at Greek Easter. And it seems that this Greek Easter celebration is important to Fotis. And Fotis had been unhappy because Jennifer wouldn't let the kids come because Michelle was there. Pawel worked Monday to Friday. He said 8 to 5, but sometimes it was different, like 7 to 4. He described basically 8 or 9 hour days, and the time wasn't fixed, but it's clearly sort of normal business hours, right? To me, this was important because the Tacoma was seen leaving Mountain Springs at 5 in the morning, and Pawel doesn't live there. Pawel lives in another town, and it's such a pain in the butt to drive in to Farmington that he just leaves his Tacoma at Group for the entire week. So for him to be driving that Tacoma at 5:30 in the morning, an hour at which he doesn't work, and when he would have no reason to, because if he is going to work, he's already got the Raptor and he keeps the Raptor. So that leads me to think, no, it wasn't Pawel driving that Tacoma that morning. Fotis Dulos had been at Pawel's house twice, but Pawel says no, they were not close friends. Pawel describes how he would take the vehicles. He preferred to drive the Jeep, but so did Michelle. So oftentimes he ended up with the Raptor. Sometimes he ended up with the Jeep. He would drop off his Tacoma and take whatever vehicle he was using. And he would keep that vehicle for the entire work week, return it on the Friday and take his Tacoma home for the weekend. And he had a project, and I think this is important to note too, for the prior almost a year in New Canaan. And here's a thing I wasn't clear on. So I have a question for you if you know. In the 4-group office, did any of you see a kitchen that was part of the office? That's a really important point, whether there was a kitchen in that office or not. This is how Pawel describes it. Normally, he would leave his Tacoma key in the kitchen drawer up in the office. That's how he described it. The reason this is so important is because Michelle describes keys in the kitchen of the house that Pawel would get the key to the Raptor from that drawer. And then the police asked, well, would Pawel leave his Tacoma key in the drawer? And she seemed not all that clear. And she seemed to be guessing, well, in his truck. She wasn't clear on it, but she was leaning towards a no. Pawel describes it, the key in the kitchen drawer up in the office, and he said, beside my desk. So I'm not clear. In May 2019, that Tacoma started leaking oil and Pawel was having trouble starting it sometimes. Fotis was driving the Tacoma. And the reason Pawel knew this is because he was finding empty Starbucks cups in his truck. And so he said, look, I'm not really crazy about you driving this. It's got issues. And if you get in an accident, this is not good, right? Apparently, Fotis just does what he wants anyway. And about 2 weeks prior to the crime, Fotis phoned up Pawel and said, I'm trying to start the Tacoma and it won't start. What's wrong with it? And Pawel ended up saying, well, I'll just keep turning the key. So here we have a grown man, Pawel, who is being walked on by Fotis and is not really fighting back all that hard. Then Pawel told Fotis that the Tacoma is leaking oil. And the reason Pawel told him that is because he was worried about staining Fotis's driveway. So Fotis says, well, then park it in the garage or on the grass. So that's what Pawel was doing. Well, then one day in May, Fotis asked Pawel to move the Tacoma to 80 Mountain Springs. The week of May 20th, or actually prior to that, Pawel had the Raptor all week, actually since May 13th, including the previous weekend, which was unusual. All of a sudden now, Fotis has had Pawel move the Tacoma to Mountain Springs and has just said, keep the Raptor. Pawel didn't ask him why. He didn't question it. The prosecution asked about Pawel riding dirt bikes with Fotis and Michelle. He said yes, he had gone riding once with Fotis, and he went with Fotis and Michelle one time. After break, the defense moved for a mistrial. Now, I didn't catch all of it, but from what I could gather, part of the issue was because of the judge's decision to allow Fotis's conversation with people in the office that had nothing to do with Michelle. The motion was denied. One of the things that the judge said was, look, you didn't object to other similar things before. Part of the defense response was, well, sometimes it's not important, and I don't want to be jumping up every single time. And sometimes there are other reasons why something should be allowed in, and I know that, so I'm not going to object. Or I know what the prosecution's response is going to be, and he's going to win that argument, so I'm not going to object. And then he says, I want to have a standing objection on this issue so that I don't have to jump up every single time and object. Then the prosecution says, well, I object to a continuous objection. So there's this big back and forth. Ultimately, the judge won't allow a standing objection. And he says that the defense is obligated to object every single time. So when you see him springing out of his seat and objecting, it's kind of hard to be annoyed with him because he's trying to not be doing that, but being told, well, no, you have to. We get back to Pawel's testimony. He testified that in the Tacoma, there were Ford seats. They weren't Tacoma Toyota seats. And he had done this prior to any of all this. Pawel bought a dirt bike from Michelle a year earlier. In 2018, related to work, there's this thing called Hubby Awards. Andy Loomis attended one of those. And at that time, in 2018, he was managing the property at Mountain Spring. Pawel kept his own personal dirt bike at home. Pawel said he left his dirt bike at Jefferson Crossing. He wanted to take it home for the May 24th weekend. Fotis told Pawel, don't stop by between 7 and 9 on May 24th because Fotis had a scheduled meeting with his divorce lawyer. The defense objects because all of this is irrelevant to Michelle. Pawel also testified that Fotis owned a bicycle. Now remember the photos of that Tacoma? And there appeared to be a bicycle in the bed of that truck. Anyway, this bicycle that Fotis had was his childhood bicycle, an older French-made racing bike. It was kept in the garage at 4 Jefferson Crossing, hanging on the wall. On Friday, May 24th, Pawel was home in the morning. He had the Raptor. He took his cell phone with him when he went to the job site in New Canaan. He had a telephone conversation with someone, and I think they're bringing that out because they can show that his location was where the Raptor was and not where the Tacoma was. There were things that Pawel couldn't recall. The prosecution said that was an ordinary day for you, right? The 24th. Pawel says yes. And the prosecution says, does that explain why you don't remember everything about the day? Because it's just an ordinary day. You don't think you have to remember? And Pawel agreed with that. The prosecution asked Pawel, well, did you write a timeline? Pawel said no. Well, but if his lawyer had told him to write a timeline, he might have. So this is a little bit of comparing apples and oranges here. Pawel said from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. he was at the job site in New Canaan. He said he didn't speak with Fotis, but he did have a conversation via text. And it was sometime after lunch. Pawel went to Farmington and he stopped for gas. And this is interesting. Him stopping for gas shows where he was, right? Because he's got the receipt. But the other little bit that's interesting here is because Pawel would prefer to take the Jeep instead of the Raptor. And because Michelle also liked the Jeep, they would kind of both compete for it. And Fotis preferred Pawel to take the Jeep when it wasn't necessary to have the Raptor because the Jeep was better on gas. This is just sort of what's popping in my head. This isn't what they said at this point in the testimony. If Fotis is concerned about the gas consumption, why does he suggest, almost force, Pawel to keep this Raptor for more than 2 weeks, including the weekends? This is not consistent with Fotis's normal behavior. Anyway, Pawel says he arrived at Jefferson Crossing at about 4:30. He said he went to get the key to his Tacoma, but it was not in the kitchen. And he noticed the phone there on the island. So now I know I asked earlier, well, was this the office kitchen or the kitchen in the house? And it's sounding to me like it's the kitchen in the house. And there's a phone there on the island. Pawel has a key to the office and the house. Pawel then went to Deercliff to get a board so he could load up the dirt bike. Then he went to Mountain Springs to see maybe the key to his Tacoma is actually in the Tacoma. He pulled up beside the Tacoma with the Raptor. The Tacoma was in the same location as he'd seen it the last time. The Jeep and the Suburban were there. Michelle was standing beside the Jeep and Fotis was beside the Suburban. Pawel says, well, they both look surprised to see me. That's pretty subjective. In Michelle's statement, she said they all arrived there sort of the same time. And when Pawel shows up, Michelle's near the Jeep, which she was driving, and Fotis is by the Suburban, which he was driving. So it is possible that they had just arrived, but it's possible they hadn't. So we don't know. Fotis told Pawel they were cleaning. The prosecution asks, have you ever seen Michelle clean at a work site before? And Pawel said no. That doesn't mean she didn't, but even Michelle says that was not a usual thing. Pawel did not see cleaning supplies. He said they acted normal, and Pawel was commenting on the grass that he seeded. Pawel says Fotis was wearing blue jeans with holes in them. Michelle was wearing black leggings. Pawel couldn't remember what color shirt Fotis was wearing. So they walked around the house, outside, talking about the grass. Michelle stayed in the driveway. They're all standing out front of the garage. Pawel told Fotis that he wanted his Tacoma. Michelle was standing there. Michelle said she had to do something, had to go get rugs. Pawel gets in the Raptor and notices his key in the Tacoma passenger side door. Michelle got in the Jeep. They leave. They meet at 4 Jefferson Crossing. Pawel went back to Deercliff again to leave the board and a toolbox, and then went back to Jefferson Crossing again. And I find this odd too. There's a lot of back and forth. He saw the Suburban and Fotis, but not Michelle. Fotis was in the mudroom doing something with his phone. Pawel and Fotis went to Mountain Springs again. And when they got there, Pawel noticed the key was no longer in the passenger side of the Tacoma. He asked Fotis about that, and Fotis said, oh, well, Michelle has your key. And then Fotis encouraged Pawel just to keep the Raptor over the weekend. But Pawel didn't want to keep the Raptor. So Fotis calls Michelle, and Michelle came back ostensibly to return a key, but it wasn't Michelle who gave Pawel back the key. It was Fotis. Pawel drives the Tacoma back home. And he notices nothing out of the ordinary inside the Tacoma. Anyway, after this, Fotis had followed him up to Deercliff and helped him load up the dirt bike. Fotis was acting normal. And then it comes out that Pawel has been granted immunity. On Saturday, the 25th, Fotis called Pawel in the afternoon and gave Pawel a new phone number. He doesn't mention the fact that Jennifer is missing. On May 26th in the afternoon, Fotis called Pawel and said, hey, Jennifer is missing. And he asked Pawel, well, when are you coming back to work? Well, Monday was a holiday, so Pawel said, well, I'm coming back on Tuesday. On Tuesday, Pawel drove his Tacoma to work at 8 a.m. He went in the kitchen to exchange keys with Fotis. He saw Fotis and Michelle in the kitchen. Fotis said, Jennifer's still missing. And Michelle said, oh, she thinks it's just lawyers playing games. So at that point, it seems like Michelle's not believing that Jennifer's really missing. Then Fotis asks where Pawel was on Friday. And Fotis also asked if there were contractors with Pawel. So basically, did anyone see you? Where were you? He asked if Pawel had called him on the 24th. And then asks for Pawel's phone. Well, Fotis takes Pawel's phone and he's looking through it for, according to Pawel's testimony, 5 minutes. And he's 6 feet away from Pawel now when he's looking through Pawel's phone. Then he tells Pawel, the lawyer said to write a timeline. And Pawel thought this was strange. Fotis wanted Pawel to write a timeline. And Fotis said, go through your phone, figure out everything where you were, and write out this timeline. Pawel said, you know, why do I need to do this? He just thinks it's odd. And then apparently Michelle at that time said, yeah, I don't think I want to write one either. I don't think I need to write one either. Pawel gave Fotis the Tacoma key and then they broke for lunch. After lunch, holy smoking fireworks, Batman. It got wild. Pawel got back on the stand. They were talking about May 28th. Fotis was asking Pawel, hey, on Friday the 24th, how was it that we met up again? And Pawel explained to him. But then Fotis told Pawel, oh, you know that bit with Michelle having your Tacoma key? Maybe just don't mention that to anyone. Then the prosecution gets into this. So Pawel goes to his Tacoma, and the prosecution said, did you notice anything in the back that wasn't there before? And Pawel says, yes, I saw a red bucket containing a blue hoodie in the back of the Tacoma. And he said he'd never seen that hoodie before. Well, all of a sudden, there's a sidebar. Then the jury gets excused. So they're going to argue about something. Well, there was a sweatshirt in a lawyer's office that was seized by the state police. And it's this blue sweatshirt. And there was an issue that it should never have been seized and all this. The state police had it. They tested that sweatshirt for DNA. And all over the interior of the sweatshirt was Pawel's DNA. But Pawel had denied to the police that it was his. And then when he was confronted with the fact that, well, your DNA is all over it, he said, well, actually, I did have something like that, so I guess it could be mine. Right? When this was seized by police from the lawyer's office, it was in a box. And inside this box were some tools, that sweatshirt, and a letter from this defense attorney to this other attorney related to the Troconis case. The state later tried to get this defense attorney disqualified, said, hey, he's a witness because chain of custody, right? How did he come into possession of this sweatshirt and blah, all about this sweatshirt. So the state didn't want the defense to be allowed to use this sweatshirt because remember, the DNA came back to Pawel. So the state didn't want the defense to be allowed to use this sweatshirt at all. But here they are now bringing it up. Well, here's what's going on with that. In order to get the state to drop the issue of disqualifying the defense. Oh, and by the way, the defense in turn tried to get the state disqualified. So there was a back and forth and the defense attorney had to hire his own attorney and there was a big thing. Finally, they agreed before. So the defense's attorney and the attorney for the state hammered out this agreement that if this defense counsel would agree not to introduce the contents of this box that was seized from that other attorney's office. If Schohorn agreed to not introduce these items, then the state would withdraw this whole issue of getting him disqualified. And the reason he could be disqualified is because he becomes a witness. So they agree on this. So it shouldn't come in, you'd think, right? No. Through all of this, the defense had agreed that, okay, we're going to proceed as if that sweatshirt didn't exist because it may not end up to be relevant anyway. We can go without it. So the jury was never supposed to hear that. And by the way, all this arguing, the jury's not hearing any of this. But now the prosecution has purposely brought it up. And the defense is saying, well, hey, wait a minute. You said this couldn't be brought in. And the prosecutor's like, you can't bring it in, but I can bring it in. Oh, and guess what? You can't really cross-examine on it. So now the defense is denied their right to cross-examination. So they're saying to the judge, hey, wait a minute. This is fundamentally unfair. You denying the defense a right to cross-examination. So they argue back and forth about this. It was really something. And I really thought the judge was going to side with, look, if it comes in, he can cross-examine. If the state is introducing it, the state who originally didn't want it introduced, right? And the state saying, yeah, well, he can't introduce it, but we didn't ever really agree that we wouldn't use it somehow. Just he can't use it the way he wants, but we can use it the way we want. This was crazy. apparently, anyway, not being able for the state to be able to say what they want and the defense to not be able to cross-examine is prejudicial, right? So then the prosecution in this hearing says, well, when we're talking about this sweatshirt in the bucket, we're not saying it was in the box at the attorney's office. We're not saying that. The defense says, okay, well, if I'm not allowed to cross-examine on things in the box and you're saying you're not saying this sweatshirt was in the box, then I can cross-examine on it. And it turns out there's a portion of Pawel's police interview where the police confront him with this sweatshirt and say, this is your sweatshirt. And he says, no, it's not. But Pawel, your DNA, it's full of your DNA. It's everywhere inside this shirt. So then Pawel backpedaled and said, yeah, well, I do have sweatshirts like that, but I thought that one was darker than the one I had and this sort of thing. So in the hearing today, the defense says, okay, well, if the prosecution is saying this is not the one in the box, then I can cross-examine on it. And then the court says, well, the stipulation, the agreement in the other hearing about not introducing what's in the box is going to be read by the court pretty broadly. So that means that the defense can't introduce the evidence, and that seems okay because he isn't. But he adds, the defense can't even introduce the evidence on cross-examination. So completely ties the hands of the defense. I mean, I don't know how they're going to get around not having an appeal on this case if she's convicted. This just was something. So then the defense is saying, well, but Pawel had this police interrogation where he was confronted with this sweatshirt that has his DNA all over it. And ultimately, so they went back and forth, but ultimately he can't cross-examine on that either. And so he was understandably not happy. And the prosecution said, well, it's not the court. It's not us that's tying his hands. He tied his own hands by agreeing to this. And honestly, this just, to me, feels like revenge on the part of the prosecution. They wanted him disqualified. They wanted him off the case, and they couldn't do it. So they're going to stick it to him now. The problem is, who it gets stuck to is the defendant. So now the defense has to try and navigate this with his hands tied behind his back. So this was something. They bring the jury back. The jury never hears any of this. The prosecution keeps going on about the shirt. What Pawel testifies to is that he put the shirt in the bucket in the laundry room and he left in the Jeep. On the week of the 27th, he helped Michelle move some firewood, and Michelle was upset because Michelle's picture and her daughter's pictures were plastered all over the place, and Michelle was really upset about this. And according to Pawel, Michelle said, I'm going to kill the F&B when she turns up. Then it came out that this statement that Pawel is now testifying to was only recently disclosed to authorities. If Michelle is saying to a third party, when she shows up, when Jennifer turns up, I'm going to kill her. She's mad, but she's thinking she's going to turn up. If Jennifer's disappearance, that's not the thing she's saying. Pawel couldn't recall a lot of things while he was on the stand. He says, well, the reason why is because the police took his phone and he relies on his phone to recall things. I gotta say though, this business of Michelle having the key, I mean, she didn't disclose all that in her first interview. Pawel says on Tuesday or Wednesday, the 28th or 29th, Pawel was at Jefferson Crossing. He didn't see anyone home. So he called Fotis and said, Fotis, where's my truck? And Fotis says, oh, I'm on my way back with it from the car wash. And Pawel's response was, oh yeah? Did you get them to fix it too? That was interesting because Pawel's response wasn't, what? Like, if I came home and my car was gone and somebody I didn't know that well had taken it to the car wash, I mean, isn't that weird? But that's not what Pawel says. Pawel doesn't say, what? Why? Why are you taking my car to the car wash? Pawel says, oh yeah, you're getting them to fix it too. So that's interesting that he didn't question it. Then Fotis said, look, you should change these seats. Why don't you lower the price on your truck and just sell the truck? So lower the price. Well, it turns out that Pawel was already considering selling the truck, and Fotis knew this. Michelle was not present for that conversation about the seats. Fotis gave Pawel his key back, and Pawel put the key in his pocket instead of where he usually puts it. Pawel notices the Tacoma looks clean. Well, he knows it's been to the car wash, right? And the prosecution brings out that Pawel has been leaving his Tacoma at Ford Group for about a year, and Fotis never washed it before. Fotis called Pawel then and said, come and move your Tacoma because the news is here. The prosecution was asking, weren't you nervous about the fact that Fotis washed your truck? And Pawel said, no, not at that point. Were you suspicious of Fotis? No. On Thursday, May 30th, Fotis told Pawel to go get new seats and that Fotis would pay for them. And he also told Pawel that when I speak to you about it, we're going to call it hardware. We're not going to call it seats. I mean, I don't have to explain to you. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out what the heck's going on there, right? So that's when Pawel starts to get suspicious. But he complied because he was afraid he'd lose his job and his health care, and he has a family to take care of. Also, Dulos was going after another former employee pretty hard. The employee had left. Pawel didn't want to be in that position. On Friday the 31st, Pawel was at the New Canaan job site, left shortly before noon, was on his way back to Farmington when Fotis called and said, are you going to go get the hardware? So Pawel went to the junkyard, and he went to a few. And at some point, this issue of Pawel's green card came up. Fotis sent Pawel a phone number for Fotis's lawyer in case you're ever approached by the police and you don't talk to the police, you can't talk to them. Pawel didn't understand this. Why not? Why don't I just tell them what I was doing that day? Fotis said, no, they'll lie to you, they'll back you in a corner, and you could get deported. Don't talk to them. Pawel did find Tacoma seats, and it was possible that he could have them in 2 days, but he didn't buy them. He returned to the office that afternoon. Everything's bothering Pawel. So finally, Pawel just breaks down and he asks Fotis, why did you clean my truck? Fotis' response is, don't worry about it. Everything will be fine. Don't worry about it. Well, we've heard this before. This response from Fotis. In Michelle's interview, when she was asked, well, how did Fotis respond? When you were asking questions, and Michelle said, well, he said, don't worry about it. Don't worry, it'll be fine. That sort of thing. This is a thing that Fotis does. Just, don't worry about it. He doesn't want anyone around him to be thinking. But Pawel kept pressing the issue, and it was making Fotis mad. And finally, Fotis said, look, I went to see Jennifer and to visit the kids, and I hugged Jennifer, and I held her cat, and then when I was driving your Tacoma, I was wearing the same clothes as I wore when I was at Jennifer's, so I was worried maybe a hair got somewhere, and now she's disappeared, so that's what it's about. And Fotis was really pressing Pawel, like, look, just do this. Just get those seats changed. And Fotis ultimately said, well, use the Porsche seats. So Pawel went to Deercliff, and he couldn't get the seats out right away, went back to Jefferson. Fotis insisted that he get this done and told Pawel to get rid of the seats so no one will ever find them. And Pawel didn't think that Fotis was capable of the crime. He took the seats from the Porsche. They got into that time that Pawel was driving by for Jefferson Crossing and then turned around and left, and the police spotted him. Do you remember all that? Well, he described that incident. At that time, even though he had just come from Deercliff removing those Porsche seats, he told the police that he was coming from New Canaan, from a job site. When asked to explain that to the court, why does he said that, he stumbled and he didn't really have an answer. He said someone, and he doesn't recall who, asked Pawel to go to the pond. He was to pick up Michelle's mother and daughter. He did that. He brought them to Fort Jefferson. Later on, he took Michelle, the mother, and daughter to a hotel. Then he went home and he changed out the seats. So he had the Porsche seats. He goes home and he changes out these seats. The Ford seats that were in the Tacoma, he took those out and he says he put them in his garage, and his claim on the stand was that he wanted to keep the seats that originally were in the Tacoma just in case somebody might need them in the future, in case the police asked about them. Well, my question then is, why then change the seats at all? Why not just tell the police about that? On June 2nd, the police came and seized Pawel's phone. When asked in court, did he consent? He said yes. But actually, he wasn't sure about consenting, and he called a lawyer, and the lawyer said, yeah, well, they can get a warrant and seize it anyway. He ended up handing over his phone because it would have been quicker for the police to take the phone and download it, then he could have it back. And the police discovered that there were deleted items on Pawel's phone. When asked by the prosecution, Pawel said he didn't know what the deleted items were. Well, the deleted items were searches on his phone related to the disappearance of Jennifer Dulos. I know they're going to say, oh, remember that time that Fotis had his phone and was doing something on Pawel's phone? Maybe Fotis is the one who deleted these searches. Why? And if Fotis is deleting searches, did Fotis have the phone to do the searches in the first place? It's just a little bit, it's not quite hanging together for me here. So the prosecution then moves to, well, did you ever clear your searches before? And Pawel says, oh yeah, he clears his searches regularly because he was told by somebody that if you don't do that, it slows down your phone. So what I want to know is, were the searches related to Jennifer's disappearance the only searches that were deleted? Or was his entire search history deleted? And at the time the police are there, they're getting his phone, he didn't tell the police about the seats. Now, he just finished saying, oh, I wanted to keep those seats in case anyone asked questions. Well, now they're seizing his phone, and he doesn't tell them about these seats. The police left and they returned. The police said that they had to take the Jeep Cherokee. Pawel has the Jeep Cherokee and the Tacoma at his house. So how did he get both vehicles there? Somewhere along the line, I've missed something here as to how that happened. The description has been about Pawel going around looking for seats, and now he's driving around in the Jeep. So how did he get to Farmington to get the Jeep if he didn't take the Tacoma, if the Tacoma's at home? There's missing information here. It's not, unless they described this whole thing and I just didn't catch it, I don't know. The police said to him that they wanted him to show them this motorcycle route that he and Fotis had been on. To accompany the police to show them where the motorcycle route was, instead of taking the Tacoma, which he had, he decided to take his wife's vehicle. So he takes his wife's vehicle, he goes with the police and is showing them where the trails were. When he pulled over to turn around, that's when the police handed him a search warrant and said, we're serving a search warrant on you for that Tacoma. We're seizing your Tacoma. And that's when Pawel says, oh, by the way, there's these seats. So, as much as he said, oh, I was keeping them in case anyone asked questions, he didn't turn them over until he thought he was in trouble. Then he had an interview with police. He had his lawyer. There was a lawyer there for him and 2 detectives. At that point, he gave DNA, and they were just about to get into exhibits, but that was the end of the time for today. There are a number of things that are coming up that are troubling on multiple fronts. The defense's hands are being tied. I mean, that was just crazy. Michelle has been short on telling the whole truth. Fotis is, well, Fotis, right? And Pawel, sometimes he seems to be going along with Fotis, but when it comes down to it and he's got to save his own butt, he goes along with the police, but not until he has to. That's all I got for you today. Trust your gut. I'll see you in the comments.